Most people think they know what evil looks like: a shadow in an alley, a stranger's face in a mugshot. But the most terrifying killers don't fit neatly into those pictures. Some are drifters fueled by nothing but rage, leaving bodies scattered across continents. Some kill so many that even investigators struggle to count their victims. And some invite people into their homes with smiles and promises, only to turn those homes into graves. One man wrote his hatred of humanity into every crime he committed. Another slaughtered children on such a scale that his name still sends shivers through South America. And one woman transformed her farm into a trap that swallowed anyone who believed her lies. These are three of the most disturbing serial killers history has ever known. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And subscribe, because you won't forget this. Carl Panzram was born in 1891 on a bleak Minnesota farm, the son of impoverished Prussian immigrants, and almost from the start, his life seemed bent toward violence. Raised in a harsh household where discipline was measured with fists and pushed into a world that seemed indifferent to his suffering, Panzram carried a deep and growing hatred that hardened as he aged. By the time he was barely a teenager, he was already breaking into homes, stealing and lashing out at anyone who crossed him. His early years were marked by repeated stints in reform schools and prisons, places that claimed to rehabilitate but instead brutalized him further. He later described these institutions as factories of cruelty, where beatings and humiliation taught him that power belonged to those who inflicted pain, not those who endured it. Every lash, every locked cell, every betrayal carved bitterness deeper into him until hatred itself became his guiding principle. He admitted in later writings that he felt no loyalty to God, man, or country, that his only joy came from destruction. As he drifted into adulthood, Panzram lived as a hobo, riding the rails, wandering from town to town, and leaving chaos wherever he went. What set him apart from other drifters was not simply his violence, but his philosophy. He openly declared that he killed because he hated people, and he hated people because he had been taught only cruelty. His crimes began with thefts and assaults, but soon escalated to murder, committed without hesitation or remorse. In his own chilling words, he once claimed, "I was so full of hate that there was no room left for anything else." This wasn't just a man who killed for money, revenge, or even pleasure. This was a man who saw murder as a form of expression, the only language left to him after a lifetime of abuse and betrayal. From the farms of Minnesota to the jails of the Midwest, from the streets of New York to ports across the globe, Carl Panzram carried his hatred like a weapon, ready to unleash it on anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. By the time Carl Panzram reached adulthood, he had become a restless drifter whose entire life was defined by crime, violence, and contempt for humanity. He roamed across the United States like a storm without a center, breaking into homes, torching buildings, stealing wherever he could, and escalating his crimes at every opportunity. But Panzram was not confined to one country. His wandering eventually took him overseas, where his brutality followed him across oceans. In 1920, after enlisting in the U.S. military and quickly deserting, he stole from naval vessels, made his way to Europe, and left a trail of victims in ports from Africa to South America. He claimed to have killed men in Angola, where he worked briefly at an oil company before allegedly luring laborers away to their deaths. He confessed to murdering sailors he met while traveling, strangling or shooting them without hesitation. To Panzram, the method didn't matter. It was the act itself, the power of ending another's life, that satisfied his boundless hatred. His crimes were not those of a man seeking wealth or notoriety. He killed because, in his mind, people deserved it. In one of his later written confessions, he declared that he had murdered more than 20 people, though investigators suspected the number was far higher, and that he had committed thousands of burglaries and acts of arson. He admitted to setting fire to warehouses and factories just to watch them burn, destroying livelihoods without remorse. Panzram's wandering, violent life made him nearly impossible for authorities to pin down. He used aliases, moved constantly, and drifted wherever opportunity for destruction presented itself. What made him even more chilling was his self-awareness. He kept no illusions about redemption or rehabilitation. He knew what he was, and he embraced it fully, writing years later from prison that he was a man of hate, not reform. He mocked the very idea of forgiveness, describing himself as beyond saving. Every town he passed through became a stage for his rage, and every prison he entered only hardened his resolve. He once escaped from Leavenworth, one of the most notorious prisons in the United States, and later bragged about the killings he committed both inside and outside prison walls. He seemed fueled by a sense of inevitability, convinced that he was doomed to hate and to kill until the world finally destroyed him. What haunted investigators most about Panzram was not just the scale of his crimes, but the philosophy behind them. A worldview in which cruelty was not only natural, but justified. To him, humanity was rotten, and he was merely its executioner. Carl Panzram's final years were as violent and unrepentant as the rest of his life, and the confessions he left behind remain some of the darkest ever recorded from a killer. After decades of roaming, stealing, burning, and murdering, his crimes finally caught up to him in 1928, when he was arrested and imprisoned at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. It was there, in one of America's most infamous prisons, that Panzram poured out his story in a series of handwritten confessions to a sympathetic guard named Henry Lesser. In those chilling documents, he claimed to have murdered more than 20 people and committed thousands of other crimes. What made these writings unforgettable was not the staggering scale of his offenses, but the tone in which he described them. He wrote with a cold precision, recounting murders with no sense of regret, only pride in his consistency. He admitted to killing boys, sailors, tramps, and strangers across multiple continents, claiming that every act of violence was driven by a hatred so deep it had become his only purpose in life. When asked why he committed such acts, he gave an answer as haunting as it was blunt: because he hated humanity, and he wanted to hurt it as much as possible before he died. In 1929, while serving time in Leavenworth, Panzram murdered a prison laundry foreman, bludgeoning him to death with an iron bar. When brought to trial for that murder, Panzram shocked the court by refusing to plead for mercy. In fact, he demanded the death penalty, declaring he did not want to live another day in a world he despised. The judge obliged, and on September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram was executed by hanging. His final words to his executioner were as bitter and unrepentant as the life he had lived. "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could hang a dozen men while you're fooling around." For many, his death closed the chapter on one of the most dangerous, hateful men America had ever produced. But his confessions remain, a chilling window into the mind of someone who lived entirely for destruction. His story forces us to consider the terrifying possibility of a human being without empathy, without purpose, without anything but hate. And as America exhaled in relief after his execution, South America decades later would face its own nightmare, not of a drifter fueled by hatred, but of a predator whose scale of killing was almost unimaginable. His name was Pedro Alonso Lopez, and history would remember him as the monster of the Andes. In the mountains and valleys of South America during the 1970s, entire towns were gripped by a terror that few could comprehend. Children vanished at an alarming rate, their disappearances dismissed at first as the chaos of poverty and migration, until the truth revealed something far more horrifying. Behind those disappearances was Pedro Alonso Lopez, the man who would later be branded the Monster of the Andes. Born in Colombia in 1948, Lopez's life began in violence and deprivation. His mother, a prostitute, raised him in the slums of Tolima, and by the time he was a boy, he had already endured abuse, neglect, and abandonment. He ran away from home and survived by scavenging, stealing, and eventually falling into the hands of predators who exploited him in the streets. These early traumas hardened him, but instead of breaking him into a victim, they twisted him into a predator. Lopez developed a chilling fixation on young girls, a compulsion that grew into one of the most prolific killing sprees in recorded history. By the mid-1970s, he had begun luring children from markets, schools, and streets in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His method was deceptively simple. He offered small gifts, whispered promises of safety, or sometimes just coaxed them into following him away from crowded spaces. Once isolated, his victims had no chance. Lopez admitted later that he killed swiftly, often strangling them before leaving their bodies in shallow graves or remote fields. Unlike other killers who escalated slowly over time, Lopez seemed to explode into mass murder, claiming lives in quick succession across borders, turning entire regions into hunting grounds. What made his crimes even more chilling was the scale. While most serial killers are linked to a handful of victims, Lopez confessed to killing over 300 children, and authorities were able to tie him definitively to dozens. The idea that one man could destroy so many lives and move across multiple countries doing it stunned the world when his crimes came to light. For families in rural South America, his name became synonymous with nightmares. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter at markets, kept them from walking alone to school, and whispered warnings about the stranger who might smile kindly one moment and then vanish into the hills with their daughters the next. The Andean landscape, once seen as vast and protective, became a place of fear because no one knew where Lopez would strike or how many children had already fallen into his grasp. The investigation into Pedro Alonso Lopez unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, because the sheer scope of his crimes was so staggering that even seasoned investigators struggled to accept the truth. In the rural regions of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, missing children were often dismissed as victims of poverty, displacement, or the violence of guerrilla groups. Police rarely connected the cases, and families, often poor and powerless, had little means of pressing for answers. This gave Lopez years of freedom to hunt, crossing borders without suspicion, striking in villages and towns that had no communication with each other. He targeted children in the spaces they felt safest, bustling markets where parents were momentarily distracted, dirt roads where children walked to school, or churchyards where trust was assumed. Witnesses described a man who seemed gentle, even fatherly, coaxing children away with candies or small gifts before leading them into isolation. Once captured in 1980, after attempting to abduct a girl in Ecuador, Lopez shocked investigators with his confessions. He did not resist questioning. In fact, he boasted, calmly explaining that he had killed hundreds of children. At first, police refused to believe him, suspecting exaggeration or madness. But then he began leading them to burial sites, shallow graves scattered across desolate fields and ravines. One by one, the bodies emerged, proof that his confessions were not fantasy, but a horrifying reality. In interviews, Lopez spoke of his crimes with chilling detachment, describing his killings as though they were inevitable, almost mechanical. He told authorities that he found comfort in watching his victims die, that he was compelled by forces he could not control. What horrified investigators most was not simply the number of murders, but the coldness with which he described them. He seemed proud of his tally, recounting the killings as though reciting achievements. Local officials in Ecuador confirmed that he had led them to over 50 graves, yet Lopez insisted there were hundreds more scattered across the Andes, stretching back years. For families who had long searched for their missing children, his arrest brought not closure, but devastation. Confirmation that their worst fears had been true all along, and that the man responsible had moved freely among them for years. Newspapers branded him the Monster of the Andes, a name that carried across the world, and criminologists struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of his crimes. Serial killers are often studied for their compulsions, their patterns, their escalation, but Lopez's story stood apart for the way he industrialized his murders, turning the vulnerability of children into an opportunity for mass killing on a scale almost unmatched in human history. When Pedro Alonso Lopez stood trial in Ecuador in 1980, the world began to comprehend the magnitude of his crimes, and even then, many wondered if the full scope would ever truly be known. The courtroom was filled with families desperate for answers, investigators haunted by what they had uncovered, and a public struggling to process the fact that one man could kill so many children across 3 nations without being stopped. Lopez remained calm throughout the proceedings, describing his killings with a detachment that stunned even the most hardened observers. He insisted that his compulsion was uncontrollable, that he was driven by urges he could not resist, and he often spoke as though he were merely recounting a routine rather than confessing to mass murder. Ultimately, Ecuadorian authorities convicted him of over 50 murders, though he had confessed to more than 300, and sentenced him to the maximum penalty allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time, just 16 years in prison. The lightness of the sentence in comparison to the scale of his crimes horrified the public. Lopez was released in 1994 after serving only 14 years, and though he was immediately deported to Colombia, his fate thereafter became shrouded in mystery. Reports suggest he was arrested again in 2002 for another murder, but whether he is still alive or dead remains uncertain. What is certain is the legacy he left behind: towns haunted by mass graves, families broken by disappearances that stretched across decades, and a nickname, the Monster of the Andes, that stands as a grim monument to his unimaginable crimes. Lopez's story forces the darkest question of all. How could a man kill hundreds of children, confess openly, and yet serve only a fraction of justice? The answer lies in the fragility of systems unprepared for such horror, in the blind spots of nations racked by poverty and unrest. His case remains one of the most disturbing reminders that sometimes the deadliest predators thrive not because they are invisible, but because the world chooses to look away until it is too late. And while Lopez's shadow lingered over South America in the American Midwest decades earlier, another killer was building her own legacy of terror. But unlike Lopez, she did not stalk children in markets or lure strangers off the streets. Instead, she invited men into her home with the promise of love, security, and wealth. Her name was Belle Gunness, and her farm in LaPorte, Indiana, became one of the most infamous graveyards in American history. At the turn of the 20th century, when America still romanticized its rural farmlands as places of hard work, faith, and honesty, one quiet farm in LaPorte, Indiana, concealed a darkness that would eventually shock the nation. The farm belonged to Belle Gunness, a Norwegian immigrant who arrived in the United States seeking opportunity, but instead became one of history's most notorious female killers. Born in 1859 in Norway, Belle grew up poor, but those who knew her later recalled a calculating and ambitious streak that set her apart. By the time she immigrated to America, she had already begun constructing the mask she would wear for years, that of a strong, hard-working woman determined to carve out her own place in the world. She married twice, and both husbands died under suspicious circumstances. Deaths attributed to accidents or sudden illness, though in reality they laid the foundation for Belle's pattern of using death as a means of profit. Insurance payouts provided her with financial security, and soon she realized that killing could be more rewarding than farming ever was. But it was not her husband's deaths that made Belle infamous. It was what came after. On her farm in Indiana, she began placing ads in newspapers across the Midwest, aimed at lonely immigrant men searching for companionship and stability in a new country. The ads were carefully worded, painting her as a respectable widow seeking a husband to share her prosperous farm and future. Men from across the region responded, often bringing with them their savings or valuables, believing they were stepping into a new life. What awaited them was a trap. Belle welcomed these men into her home with smiles, hearty meals, and promises of marriage, but once they were inside her walls, they rarely left again. Neighbors occasionally asked after the steady stream of suitors who arrived at her door, only to vanish days later, but Belle always had plausible explanations. They had moved west. They had left suddenly for business. They had decided not to stay. In reality, she was luring them to their deaths. The bodies of these men, buried in shallow graves or hidden beneath her farm, would eventually reveal the terrifying truth. Belle Gunness had turned her home into a slaughterhouse of greed and betrayal. The story of Belle Gunness grew darker as investigators later uncovered just how many men had entered her home, only to disappear forever. By the early 1900s, Belle had refined her deadly operation into something disturbingly efficient. She would correspond with suitors through letters, charming them with promises of love, security, and shared prosperity. When they arrived at her LaPorte farm, often carrying their life savings, she disarmed them with warmth and hospitality. Neighbors saw her as a hard-working widow who managed her land with unusual strength, and when visitors came and went, they assumed she was merely entertaining prospects of marriage. But what no one realized was that Belle had developed a chilling ritual. After gaining her suitors' trust and encouraging them to hand over their money, she would drug their food or drink, incapacitating them before finishing the act with a blow or slit throat. Their bodies were then dragged to her farmyard, where she buried them in shallow pits, often alongside animal remains to mask the smell of decomposition. Over time, her farm became less a home and more a graveyard. Reports suggest that she killed at least a dozen men this way, though some estimates stretch to as many as 40. Even her children and stepchildren were not entirely safe from her methods. 2 of her daughters died under suspicious circumstances, with doctors citing illness but neighbors later suspecting poison. Belle's greed was insatiable, and each new victim seemed to embolden her further. She built her reputation as a respectable woman in town, donating occasionally to the church and attending social functions, all while continuing her murderous schemes in the shadows. Yet rumors began to swirl. Locals noted the odd frequency with which Belle's suitors vanished. Relatives of missing men began arriving in LaPorte, demanding answers, and while Belle offered explanations, her calmness under suspicion was itself unsettling. By 1908, tension around her farm reached a boiling point. That year, her farmhouse burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances, and when the ashes cooled, investigators made a discovery that stunned the nation. In the charred ruins were multiple bodies, including what was believed to be Belle's. But something about the remains didn't add up. The supposed body of Belle was smaller than expected, missing her distinctive head and features, leaving investigators to wonder whether she had staged her own death. As they searched the grounds, the true horror emerged. Digging in the farmyard, they unearthed body after body, men who had vanished months or years before, their dreams of love and prosperity buried in shallow graves on Belle's land. The discoveries transformed her farm into one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history, and the legend of Belle Gunness, the Black Widow of LaPorte, was born. The discovery of the graves on Belle Gunness's farm in 1908 horrified not only LaPorte, Indiana, but the entire nation, because it forced Americans to confront the terrifying possibility that the warm, respectable widow they thought they knew had been running a death farm for years. As investigators dug deeper into the soil of her property, they uncovered more and more remains: torsos, skulls, bones tangled with the roots of her orchards, each one belonging to a man who had answered her ads and arrived with dreams of marriage. Among the bodies were also the remains of children, fueling the suspicion that Belle had murdered some of her own offspring when they became inconvenient or stood in the way of her schemes. The press seized on the story, painting Belle as a black widow whose greed had turned her home into a graveyard. The mystery of her final fate only added to the legend. The body found in the ruins of her burned farmhouse was never conclusively identified as hers. It lacked her height and weight, and the missing head prevented any certainty. Some believed she had faked her death, murdered another woman to stage the scene, and fled with her remaining money to start over elsewhere. Over the decades, alleged sightings of Belle Gunness trickled in from across the country, fueling speculation that she had escaped justice entirely. Whether she died in the fire or lived to kill again remains one of true crime's enduring mysteries. What cannot be denied, however, is the scale of her deception and cruelty. Belle Gunness transformed the vulnerabilities of lonely, hopeful men into opportunities for profit, manipulating not only her victims, but also the society that trusted her as a hard-working widow. Her case stands as a chilling reminder that killers do not always wear the mask of violence. Sometimes they wear aprons, attend church, and smile kindly while hiding graveyards beneath their feet. Placed alongside Carl Panzram, who murdered out of sheer hatred, and Pedro Alonso Lopez, who slaughtered children on an unimaginable scale, Belle Gunness completes a triad of horror that spans continents and motives. Together, their stories reveal the darkest truth of all. Evil has no single face. It can be fueled by rage, by compulsion, or by greed, but in every form, it thrives in the spaces we least expect until it is too late to stop it. Evil doesn't wear one mask. Carl Panzram's hatred, Pedro Alonso Lopez's scale, and Belle Gunness's deception prove that killers can strike from anywhere. A drifter, a stranger, even a smiling widow at the door. If these stories haunted you, subscribe now and tell me in the comments which case shocked you most. Because history forgets names, but the shadows they leave behind never disappear.